They said the war ended in 1945, but for her, it never ended. For her, the world didn't flip a page into peace. It froze in the exact moment she found the letter, missing in action. Those 3 words were the beginning of a fire she never managed to put out. Not because she didn't try, but because that fire wasn't meant to be extinguished. It was meant to guide her, meant to shape her into something the Nazis never saw coming. Something silent, patient, invisible, and unstoppable. Her name was Eleanor Wade, a 23-year-old American nurse who had crossed the Atlantic believing she was going to save lives. What she didn't know was that she was walking into a war that would claim everything she had ever loved. Her fiancé, Carter, a radio operator, disappeared during a covert mission in France. His unit was ambushed by a local Nazi death squad known for leaving no survivors. Files were shredded, bodies uncounted, the world moved on. But she didn't. Eleanor wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained to fight. She wasn't built for revenge, not at first. But the strange thing about heartbreak is that it teaches you things no training manual ever could. It sharpens the senses. It kills fear. It rewires the soul. Months after V-Day, while the celebrations echoed across New York and flags waved across Times Square, Eleanor found something the world wasn't looking for. A clue. A tiny, overlooked, almost invisible footnote in a military archive. A German officer named Klaus Ritter claiming to have relocated Allied prisoners before the end of the war. Relocated. The word stabbed her. It was a lie. It was always a lie. Ritter had disappeared into the chaos of surrender. The Allies never found him. The Americans declared him untraceable. But Eleanor, she traced him anyway. It began with long nights in abandoned intelligence buildings, whispering through leftover documents, listening to retired OSS agents who remembered the shadows, the betrayals, the coded routes Nazis used to escape through Spain and Italy. And every night before she slept, she whispered the same sentence. "I'm going to find him, Carter. I'm going to find the man who took you from me." People thought she was grieving. They had no idea she was hunting. And this is where her story stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a warning, because Eleanor Wade became something no one expected a woman to become in 1946. She became a ghost, a phantom following faint trails of Nazi fugitives across Europe. She changed names, learned accents, burned fingerprints off her own hands so no border guard could track her. And in the ruins of Munich, in the middle of winter, she finally found the first man who knew Ritter, a former SS radio officer hiding under a fake identity, working as a butcher. The snow fell quietly on the empty street when she entered his shop. The man never saw fear in her eyes, only purpose. And in the moment he whispered Ritter's name, his new country, his hiding place, she didn't feel victory. She didn't feel relief. She felt something darker, confirmation. The war wasn't over. Not yet. For women like Eleanor, peace was just the pause between battles. And this was only the beginning. People imagine revenge as fire, hot, explosive, chaotic. But for Eleanor, revenge was ice, silent, controlled, calculated. She moved like someone who had spent months studying the enemy's habits, memorizing patterns, anticipating fear. Each step she took across post-war Europe brought her closer to the man who had haunted her dreams since the day Carter vanished. Spain. That was the first destination spoken by the butcher. A route used by Nazi escape networks, forged papers, bribed border guards, priests who looked the other way, American soldiers too homesick to care. Eleanor followed the trail like a shadow. She slept in train stations, ate whatever she could find, wore clothes donated by widows who recognized the same grief in her eyes that they carried in their own. But grief wasn't her weakness. It was her weapon. On a foggy morning in Barcelona, Eleanor located a man rumored to have helped SS officers escape, a former Gestapo translator named Emil Hart. She approached his home disguised as a French volunteer seeking food rations. Her dress was simple, her accent perfect, her hands steady. She had practiced every detail 100 times. Hart let her inside without hesitation. That was his mistake. The moment she stepped into his living room and saw the medals he kept hidden under the floorboards, symbols of pride he should have burned years ago, something inside her snapped. Not loudly, not violently, quietly, like the soft click of a trigger being pulled. She tied him to a chair using the same knots she once used to secure wounded soldiers to gurneys. He never stood a chance. "Where is Ritter?" she asked. Hart's eyes widened. He tried to bluff. She cut through the lies one by one. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Calmness is far more terrifying when held by someone who has nothing left to lose. After an hour, he broke. He revealed everything: names of smugglers, ports, fake identity papers, and finally, the country Ritter had escaped to: South America, the final sanctuary of hundreds of Nazi officers. Hart begged for mercy, but mercy died with Carter. She left the house without looking back, blending into the noise of the street. Nobody suspected the quiet American woman walking past them had just dismantled a piece of a Nazi escape network with nothing but strategy and cold determination. That night, she sat at a small harbor watching ships vanish into the horizon. She wasn't afraid of what was coming. She wasn't afraid of becoming someone the world wouldn't recognize. She was afraid of only one thing: the possibility that Ritter might die before she reached him. Because death wasn't punishment. Death was escape. And she wanted him to feel something first. Something he had given to so many families, to so many women who waited years for men who never came home. She wanted him to feel fear. Real fear. The kind that crawls through the veins, whispering that the past is catching up. And Eleanor Wade was the past, walking straight toward him. The streets of Buenos Aires were thick with smoke from evening fires, the kind that never fully cleared, no matter how many nights passed. Eleanor had learned long ago that the air of a city held secrets, that the faint smell of burnt wood, petrol, and metal could sometimes lead her closer to the men she hunted. Every step she took was careful, measured. She had lost too much to stumble blindly now. Every ounce of her being had become a compass, pointing toward Klaus Ritter. Every memory of Carter, of the letters he never sent, of the last look in his eyes, sharpened her focus. There was no room for error, no time for doubt. This was a hunt, pure and simple, and she was about to strike at the heart of it. Through small alleyways and quiet streets lined with shuttered shops, Eleanor traced the life of the man who had haunted her dreams for years. Ritter had assumed a new identity, blending seamlessly into Buenos Aires society. To the casual eye, he was just another expatriate businessman, living comfortably, unnoticed. But Eleanor had learned to see what others missed: the slight hesitation when a stranger approached, the nervous twitch when someone spoke a name from the past, the way shadows clung unnaturally to men who carried secrets heavier than any coat. She spent days observing him from a distance, noting his routine, memorizing the faces around him, cataloging the times he left and returned. Each observation brought a new piece of the puzzle, a fragment closer to the confrontation she had imagined every night for the past decade. And yet, there was something unsettling about the calm of his existence. Ritter moved like a man who had convinced himself he had escaped justice. He smiled in public, he waved at neighbors, he laughed, lightly, often. To anyone else, he seemed harmless. But Eleanor knew better. She had seen the destruction he left in Europe. She had witnessed the small towns burned, families torn apart, lives extinguished before they had a chance to bloom. The thought that he lived freely while Carter's life was stolen ignited a cold fire inside her. She wasn't seeking closure. She wasn't seeking comfort. She wanted him to feel a fraction of the fear, the loss, the helplessness that countless others had endured at his hands. Eleanor approached him under the guise of a charitable volunteer offering assistance to war refugees. Her Spanish was perfect, practiced until every syllable sounded like it had been molded by the city itself. She spoke softly, politely, carefully weaving questions into conversation that could draw him out, test his nerves. Ritter, confident in his anonymity, laughed, unaware that the woman before him was not merely inquisitive, but a predator, silent, calculating, and deadly. Every answer he gave, every story he told about helping displaced families, was another thread in the net Eleanor had spun for him over weeks. That night, she followed him to a secluded villa on the outskirts of the city. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, the wind carrying a whisper of rain that promised to wet the streets and wash away footprints. Eleanor watched him enter, noting the guards, the dogs, the locked gates. Everything was as expected, meticulous, careful, paranoid. He had spent years preparing for threats from imagined enemies, never suspecting the quiet American woman who had crossed continents in silence, learning, observing, waiting. and Eleanor had no intention of letting chance dictate this encounter. She moved with the precision of someone who had trained herself on grief, pain, and obsession. She scaled walls, bypassed alarms, and slipped inside like a shadow, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. The first moment of contact was almost anticlimactic. Ritter turned, startled by the faintest sound in the darkened hall. His eyes widened as he registered the figure before him, Eleanor Wade, the woman the Allies had never trained, the woman history had never recorded, the woman he had dismissed as powerless. She didn't speak, she didn't shout, she didn't demand explanations. Her presence alone was accusation enough. Ritter's confidence faltered, and in that falter, Eleanor saw the first flicker of the fear she had come to deliver. "You've hidden for too long," she whispered. Her voice was steady, calm, yet carrying the weight of years of pain and determination. "You think time erased what you did, that justice forgot the people you destroyed, but I never forgot." Ritter stammered, attempting lies, excuses, false apologies. Eleanor listened to each word like a doctor listening to a heartbeat, understanding the pulse of guilt, the rhythm of fear, the truth beneath the surface. This man had lived pretending he was untouchable, untouchable by governments, by law, by morality, but Eleanor's hunt proved that untouchable was an illusion, and no amount of geography, falsified papers, or wealth could shield him from what she represented, the embodiment of every loss he had inflicted. By dawn, Ritter's life had changed irrevocably. Eleanor left as silently as she had arrived, leaving him to grapple with the realization that the war was not over, not for him, not for those he had destroyed. And for Eleanor, every step back into the quiet streets, every breath of rain-soaked air, was confirmation that her path was just beginning. There were more men, more names, more ghosts to chase. The hunt was far from over, and the fire inside her would burn until the last one faced the reckoning he had evaded for so long. Paris was waking slowly beneath a pale winter sun, its streets still carrying the remnants of a war the world claimed was over. Eleanor arrived unnoticed, blending into the crowds like she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Each footstep was deliberate, each glance calculated. She carried with her the weight of months spent tracking Ritter, and now her attention shifted to the network that had helped him escape, a labyrinth of men who had skirted justice for years, confident that borders and oceans made them untouchable. She checked into a modest pension near Montmartre, a place that smelled faintly of bread and coal smoke, where no one would remember her face by morning. From this vantage, she began tracing leads, poring over old papers, forged passports, letters intercepted by the Allies, and conversations with locals who had once hidden Nazis for money, for fear, or for pride. Every name she uncovered, every address she recorded, added another layer to the web that would eventually trap Ritter and his accomplices. Eleanor's obsession had become methodical. Her grief had transformed into meticulous strategy. At night, she visited the cafes and bars along the Seine, listening. Paris whispered secrets to those who could hear. Eleanor listened, not to gossip, not to idle chatter, but to fragments of truth. Names, hints, a word too carefully spoken. These were the breadcrumbs leading her closer to those who had survived because the world had turned its gaze elsewhere. Her patience was infinite, and her understanding of human fear had become almost surgical. Every man she encountered carried a subtle tell, a tremor, a hesitation when discussing the past, and she recognized these signs instantly. She found herself at a small apartment near the Latin Quarter, where a former Gestapo officer now called himself Henri Dupont, claiming to be a simple accountant. He had escaped Germany with false papers and an identity that the Allies had assumed safe. Eleanor had observed him for days, noting the way he avoided eye contact when old war references came up, the way his hands shook when recounting mundane stories. She waited until nightfall, when the streets were empty and the world around him had lulled into false security, before making her move. Entering quietly, she used the shadows as allies, moving like a ghost through the narrow halls. Dupont's first reaction was a start, a reflexive glance over his shoulder that barely concealed terror. He didn't recognize her as a nurse, as an American, as a woman who had crossed oceans and braved months of darkness and danger for the sole purpose of holding him accountable. He only saw the inevitability of justice in the calm, piercing eyes that met his. "You thought the world had forgotten," Eleanor said softly, letting her words hang in the air like a specter. "You thought no one would come for you, but here I am, and I know everything." Dupont scrambled, trying to hide documents, but Eleanor was relentless. Every move he made, every attempted evasion, only confirmed the effectiveness of her planning. She had anticipated every hiding place, every deception, every layer of false identity. Within moments, she had secured the documents, cataloged the connections, and ensured that there would be no escape this time. This was not just revenge, it was precision. Each man she confronted, each secret she uncovered, each life she disrupted in pursuit of justice was a measure of the balance that had been stolen from so many families. Eleanor was no longer the grieving nurse. She had become a calculated force, a shadow of retribution that crept silently behind those who had once thought themselves untouchable. As she stepped back into the quiet Paris streets, a thin rain began to fall, pattering against cobblestones and washing away the footprints she had left behind. Eleanor welcomed the rain, the chill, the loneliness, because it reminded her that this path, though dark and isolated, was righteous. She moved onward, knowing Ritter was still out there, knowing that the men who had hidden him, helped him, supported him, every one of them, would soon face the reckoning they had evaded for years. Each day in Paris, each silent surveillance, each calculated confrontation built toward the inevitable. Eleanor's obsession with justice had transformed into a mission, a relentless pursuit that left no room for fear, no room for hesitation, no room for mercy. She was closing in. Ritter's network was unraveling, piece by piece, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to arrive. And in the cold, quiet hours before dawn, Eleanor allowed herself one thought, a single, fiery pulse of certainty that fueled every action, every risk, every step she had taken. The man who had taken everything from her, who had stolen the life of the man she loved, would not escape. Not this time, not ever. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against the skin and makes every sound sharper, more meaningful. Eleanor had spent weeks following Ritter's trail, watching, listening, calculating. Every name she had uncovered, every document she had seized, brought her closer to the inevitable confrontation that had been building in her mind for years. Ritter was careful, far more careful than any man had a right to be, yet Eleanor's patience, her grief-turned strategy, had outlasted his caution. She had become a shadow that never faltered, a presence that did not tire, a storm that gathered quietly before the strike. The villa on the outskirts of Sao Paulo loomed in the distance, nestled between the dense shadows of trees and the narrow curves of unlit streets. Ritter's presence was unmistakable, the subtle signs, the patterns, the habits she had studied relentlessly. Eleanor approached with the calm of someone who had rehearsed every possible scenario, every contingency, every unexpected variable. This was no longer about documents, about networks, about connections. This was personal. Carter's memory had sharpened into an unyielding edge, and Eleanor wielded it with deadly precision. Inside the villa, Ritter moved as if the world had forgiven him, unaware that every quiet moment of safety he felt was an illusion. Eleanor had learned that fear was most potent when hidden beneath confidence, when a man believed himself untouchable. And now, after years of tracking, observing, preparing, she was the embodiment of that fear, silent, unstoppable, inevitable. She slipped past guards, bypassed alarms, and entered the grand hallway where Ritter believed he was alone. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows, dancing on the walls like echoes of the past he could not escape. Ritter's first realization that he was not alone came too late. Eleanor was already across the room, her movement precise, deliberate, a predator closing the distance with calm inevitability. "It's over," she whispered, her voice a low, controlled promise, not a threat, but the absolute certainty of what was to come. Ritter's confidence faltered as he stumbled backward, the weight of the past crashing into the present. All the lies, all the false identities, all the comfort he had built for himself dissolved in the room's cold air. "You thought time erased everything?" Eleanor continued, stepping closer. "You thought no one would remember, no one would care. But I did. I remember every face, every scream, every life you stole. And now it comes back to you." Ritter tried to speak, to fabricate excuses, to grasp at the illusion that she was just another woman, untrained, insignificant. But Eleanor had outlived his expectations. She had outsmarted him at every turn, predicted every movement, and anticipated every lie. In the quiet of the room, he understood, with an icy clarity, that he was powerless. This woman carried the weight of justice, the precision of strategy, and the fury of every wrong he had committed. She moved silently, swiftly, securing him in place, leaving no room for negotiation or delay. Every action she took was methodical, measured, and purposeful, a reflection of the years she had spent preparing for this moment. Eleanor's mind was a map of every betrayal, every destruction, every loss he had caused. She would not allow him to escape. Not tonight, not ever. The confrontation lasted mere moments, yet it carried the weight of a decade. Ritter's fear, previously dormant, surfaced fully, consuming him from the inside. Eleanor did not shout, she did not strike blindly. Every word, every movement, every breath was deliberate. She forced him to face the truth of his life, the crimes he had committed, and the reckoning that had been patiently stalking him for years. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, and Eleanor allowed herself a moment to feel the magnitude of what she had achieved, not just in this confrontation, but in the countless hours of preparation, sacrifice, and relentless pursuit. This was more than revenge, it was closure, forged through determination, discipline, and unyielding commitment. As Ritter finally realized the inevitability of his fate, Eleanor stepped back into the shadows, silent, untouchable, and unstoppable. She had completed one part of her mission, yet the path ahead remained. There were still others, still men who had escaped justice, still names to uncover, still faces to haunt. But in this moment, she allowed herself the briefest sense of triumph, a flicker of satisfaction that for the first time in years, the scales had tilted, if only slightly, in favor of the women and families who had suffered. Eleanor walked away from the villa under the muted glow of the night sky, rain beginning to fall softly, washing the streets and blending her footprints with the shadows. She knew the hunt was not over. There would always be more, because the war had created more ghosts than any one person could hunt. Yet, in this quiet, deliberate movement through the city, Eleanor understood something profound. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a reckoning. The sun was barely rising over the jagged horizon of the Brazilian coast when Eleanor finally found herself standing before the final chapter of her hunt. Ritter's villa loomed in the distance, more fortress than home, shadows hiding corners meant for secrets. The months of tracking, observing, confronting had led her to this singular moment, the moment where grief, obsession, and justice would collide. She had carried Carter's memory like armor, the faces of every victim like a map, guiding her silently, relentlessly. Every step toward that villa was measured, every breath controlled, every heartbeat a countdown. Inside, Ritter had begun to sense the inevitability of the reckoning. He had long assumed the world had forgotten, that his false identities, the bribes, the networks of men and women who had sheltered him had secured his freedom. But Eleanor's presence now shattered every illusion. He did not see her coming. He felt her. The weight of her focus, the sharpness of her gaze, the quiet intensity that had stalked him across continents. She was the embodiment of the lives he had destroyed, the embodiment of every scream silenced too soon, every family torn apart, every soul lost. Ritter attempted to flee as Eleanor entered the main hall, but the planning, the preparation, the months of studying his habits had given her every advantage. She anticipated his moves before he made them, blocked every exit, neutralized the guards with quiet efficiency. He realized too late that no borders, no bribes, no false identities could save him from the reckoning that had been years in the making. Eleanor had become a force of inevitability, a ghost who could not be ignored, a shadow that would not relent. "You thought the war was over," she said softly, almost tenderly, though her voice carried the weight of fury. "You thought time healed all wounds. You thought no one would remember, no one would care. But I remember. I've carried every loss, every scream, every face. And now, it comes back to you. Ritter's panic was immediate, his confidence crumbling as he realized the depth of her resolve. He tried to speak, to fabricate excuses, to bargain for his life. But Eleanor had no interest in words. Words had failed so many others. Words would not bring Carter back. Words would not undo the horrors he had committed. Her mission was precision, not debate, retribution, not forgiveness. The confrontation was swift, almost surgical. Eleanor moved with the calm certainty of someone who had spent years turning grief into strategy. She restrained him, cataloged the documents, the proof of his crimes, and ensured there would be no escape. The fear in Ritter's eyes was raw, a reflection of the countless lives he had shattered. And in that fear, Eleanor found the justice she had carried across oceans, through cities, through endless nights of observation and preparation. But even in this moment of triumph, Eleanor understood something crucial. Revenge was not simply a single act. It was a journey, a transformation. She had not only sought the man who had taken everything from her, she had become someone capable of exacting justice, someone who could navigate a world of shadows and deceit to right the wrongs that had been left unresolved. She had transformed grief into strength, loss into purpose, despair into action. When the confrontation ended, Ritter was left to face the consequences he could no longer avoid. Eleanor stepped back into the quiet streets of São Paulo, the first light of dawn glinting on the wet cobblestones, rain washing away the remnants of the night's struggle. Her footsteps were silent, deliberate, leaving no trace of the passage that had altered the course of justice for the last time. She was not triumphant in a loud, celebratory way. Her satisfaction was quiet, deep, internal, a confirmation that the hunt had been necessary, that the years of patience, pain, and planning had culminated in a moment where justice finally had a tangible form. Eleanor's journey did not end with Ritter. There were others, still hiding, still thinking themselves untouchable, still believing the world had moved on. And yet, she had proven that one woman, armed with memory, strategy, and relentless determination, could dismantle networks, unearth secrets, and confront monsters long believed to be untouchable. She had rewritten the rules of pursuit, of vengeance, and of justice. As she walked away from the villa, the wind carrying the scent of the Atlantic, Eleanor allowed herself one final thought, a quiet affirmation of the fire that had driven her for so long. The war may have ended, but the reckoning would never end for those who believed cruelty could be escaped. And Eleanor Wade, a single American woman, had become its living, breathing embodiment, silent, unstoppable, and eternal. The hunt was complete for now, but her legend, whispered across cities, archives, and shadowed alleyways, would endure far longer than the men who once thought themselves untouchable. She was more than survivor, more than avenger. She was the reckoning, the consequence, and the reminder that history remembers those who refuse to forget.